Kata got off the bus at the right stop this time. She had gotten off 2 stops before by accident and had to deal with the humiliation of waiting another hour for the next one to come, since it was Sunday. Despite the fact that it was a populous part of the city, the council evidently had other priorities. She was still a bit unsure if she was in the right place, even though she had been vigilant in watching for street names and building numbers. She went further up the road, following the direction of the bus. There were tall buildings on both sides and an overpass ahead, which she thought she remembered being described to her by her contact over the phone. The day was cool, and she felt anxious to get to the place she was going to, so she walked quickly and, as she anticipated, began to wheeze. But when she saw the sticker, a small round piece of paper bearing the letters TITE, stuck to a corner of the wall on one of the shop fronts to her right, she knew she was in the right place, and that allowed her to relax as much as she could. She checked the crumpled piece of paper she had written the address and instructions on, and checked the avenue name against the sign she saw above her. It pointed to a narrow side street that she turned down. Then, following instructions, she went to the nearest courtyard on her left, a bleak concrete affair behind a shop, shadowed by every other building around it. But she was looking at the stairs to the flat over the shop, stark metal things that led to an old clapwood door. When she got to the door, she felt her first pang of real anxiety. She had been anxious the whole time, and anxiety had always been her affliction from her first memory, making her who she was despite her best efforts against. She felt as if she wanted to just turn away and go home, an achingly familiar feeling for her. Under previous circumstances she had done so, despite the efforts, enormous as they always were for her, to get to those positions. But this time, under a self-compulsion she had taken much effort to will into being, against her most innate feelings, she knocked on the door. She heard what sounded like the squeak of a chair against the floor, but there was a quiet pause after that, and she began to wonder if she hadn't heard anything at all, and if there was no one at home. Briefly, she allowed herself to hope so. But the door opened, slightly, and she saw a young man. He didn't smile any welcome, just looked at her before saying, "Who are you?" "I'm Carter," she replied. "I think I spoke to you on the phone," she added, trying to sound normal. The man pushed the door nearly closed, and she heard him murmur something but couldn't pick out the words. For a while she felt she would be rejected or ignored, even verbally abused. She was used to such things happening to her, and she instinctively braced for humiliation and disappointment. Acceptance or rejection both felt like some kind of doom. The door opened wider and she was told to come in. She went into what was a kitchen, as stark as the rest of the surroundings she'd seen so far. There was a table with 3 chairs. In one sat another man, older. He ignored her and everything else around him as he ate what appeared to be something like a tofu casserole, and she quickly noted a pot on the oven from which steam came. She had eaten a frugal sandwich waiting for the bus, but seeing and smelling the food made her hungry again, and she hoped they would offer her some of it, but they didn't. "Yeah, I'm Moped," the younger man said. "We spoke on the phone. Yeah, sit down, yeah." He gestured to a chair. She sat and he sat as well. "This is Graham," Moped introduced the other man. "He's got most of the equipment we'll need." Equipment, Kata thought. That's what we're calling it. On the wall, over the bench next to the oven, was a crudely painted portrait of a man. Whoever the artist was obviously not usually in the business of portraiture. The face seemed angular and lined, the eyes narrowed and hazy looking, perhaps in an attempt to make the subject appear austere. It was not smiling. The image itself was distinguished by a halo of long wavy hair that came right around the face and surrounding the shoulders, where the portrait had stopped. There was a name scrawled under the picture, but Kata didn't need it. She recognised the person portrayed immediately. On other parts of the wall around the kitchen were other pictures she also recognised, black and white drawings in line, which had all been coloured in crayons, pencils and markers. It seemed a juvenile activity for adults to take part in, but to Kata these coloured-in drawings were part of what amounted to a rite of passage for people such as herself, people with a very distinct belief, an ideology that, in her case, was leading to action. TITE stood for "This is the End," the slogan for the cult they were a part of. This cult was of the view that life on Earth needed to be cut short for its own good. The reasons were as vague as they were convoluted, but the underlying reason was because of the amount of negative in the cult's parlance, quantitatively outweighed what they called the positive and neutral. That premise was the most basic article of faith, beyond conjecture and question. The very word, negative, had taken on a mythic aspect, after religions that had used words like Satan, fascist, communist and the like, to represent all that was undesirable about the sole human condition. Because of this, as this little cult reasoned, the most logical, rational course that anyone could take, indeed the entire human race should take, was to end all the negative by ending all life itself. No other allowance could be accepted. Life was not improvable, not even slightly. The matter of this case had been truly and well settled, and in this implacable resignation all other thought and action lay. The reasoning this peculiar ideology came from was from what was called inverted dialectics. This concept came from a role-playing game that took the classical Greek concept as a trope for a fictitious gang of terrorists. In this scenario, it was synthesis that came first, followed by antithesis and then thesis. In briefer terms, a pseudo-intellectual fluffing for the ends justifying the means. It was pure fictitious sophistry, never meant to be taken seriously by the game designers. But it had been taken up by one fan of the game as a rationale towards the establishment of the cult. The rationale being, if the ends are the abolition of the negative once and for all from the surface of the earth, then any means towards those ends were, by effect, positive. In fact, it transpired through constant, poorly informed and overly emotional discussion that the only positive one could do was towards the ends of abolishing the negative. Carter's cult were in fact a splinter group within a slightly larger cult called the euthanizers. This was a group of people active in a kind of populist proselytizing, spreading a gospel that was based on the positive versus negative concept of life. The ideal was simply that people voluntarily kill themselves. They would go out to argue this strange and unconvincing ideal to the public, attempting to get themselves on talkback radio, television, public talks, anywhere they hoped to have a hearing. They had made a name for themselves, but as crackpots with an ideology that was considered eccentric at best and dangerous at worst. Whenever the obvious question, "Why don't you kill yourselves?" was inevitably put to them, they would bridle as if insulted, and retort that if they did that, there would be no one to spread the message, and that by staying alive and spreading this message they were, in fact, making the greatest self-sacrifice so that others might be saved from the ravages of the negative. They never understood why hardly anyone was convinced of this logic. But the euthanizers were themselves also a subgroup of a larger movement called the palliators. This movement was also pessimist in its outlook on life, although not always resorting to concepts like negative and positive as Platonic absolutes. They took their notions from texts that claimed that life just wasn't worth the participation, for any variety of reasons drawn from the most ancient of recorded philosophy and literature to the most recent observations of the state of things. An ecumenical approach that most people they communicated with could, in some parts, agree. But they went on that while people were alive, they may as well make things as comfortable for themselves as all conditions allowed, and see the rest of their individual existences as palliation, a long-term preparation for an inevitable death. There were no calls to suicide, or indeed to any particular kind of activity at all, apart from abstaining towards having any children, since, in their view, if life isn't worth the living, it isn't worth the beginning. And while some of them leaned more heavily on that factor than others, it wasn't considered the centre of their ideology, merely a logical result thereof. Other than that, palliators had no real rules or extra demands of any kind. Indeed, some palliators were known to be quite cheerful and content with their lives, although admittedly the majority took a more pessimist, or at least nihilistic, view. But for the initial euthanizers, this was not enough. It was seen as selfish, lazy, dishonourable. Not content with this ascetic quietism, their first proponents called for action, wanting to put themselves into the public view with their views, while most admitted that there was little, if any, chance of the whole of humanity adopting their apocalyptic creed. The argument was that it was still the positive thing to do. So even if there was no hope for a worldwide collective suicide, it was still the positive thing to at least argue for that end. Logistics were secondary, and often rejected outright as a distraction from the main moral aim of the project. Ostensibly, it was a matter of moral practice. Intrinsically, for many euthanizers, an opportunity to act out a kind of heroic role in the world that they felt a strong need to play. There had been, in fact, quite some bad blood between the emerging side and its larger origins, before the euthanizers decided to declare themselves independent and exceptional from the palliators, which pleased the palliators no end, although there was still, in the public view, indistinct crossover between the two, to the chagrin of both sides. But it wasn't long before the inevitable happened, and there were those in the euthanizer camp who felt unhappy with the non-existent progress of humanity's auto-omnicide. For one thing, an argument raised that not just humans, but animals, who are undoubtedly feeling creatures themselves, should also be given the benefit of a quick, deliberate death. This raised the obvious point as to whether other species could be convinced to commit suicide. Since the obvious answer was no, some among the euthanizers argued that there was no need to do anything so stupid as to convince wild rabbits or feral cats to kill themselves. Humans would kill them. It was the only positive thing to do. So another round of acrimonious debating had occurred in the meeting places of the palliators, some of whom counter-argued that certainly animals suffer as much as humans, but the best thing to do would be to leave them alone as much as possible, and so another split had occurred, this time between those among the euthanizers who felt that they had no right to interfere with the lives of animals, and those who felt not only that they did, but it was not a right but a moral duty. In the course of these discussions, one of the more ambitious euthanizers had made an interesting discovery. A trove of what was literally thousands of videotapes of an individual who was something of an underground celebrity in another country. These tapes were a rambling combination of sermons, personal musings, imprecations, and what one underground radio station who had made some capital of playing the audio of these tapes called anti-comedy. Each tape would show a simple setting: an individual sitting at home, an elderly man who looked as if he was trying to retain his youth through transparent machismo, such as not wearing clothes and keeping his hair long, addressing the camera, speaking seemingly off the top of his head on whatever subject occupied for what passed of his mind. The chronology of the tapes was not certain, but the euthanizer who had found these tapes was smitten and began a personal mission of archiving these tapes and popularising them to her comrade euthanizers. Because the chief subject among this person's ravings was the very notion that the euthanizers had been arguing for, namely that the world was so full of the negative, it was imperative to end it all. He didn't use the same lingo as the euthanizers, of course. He would constantly refer to life as inadequate, although compared to what he never made clear. And his preferred method of global extermination, as it happened, was chemical weaponry, which, he claimed, was stored in such abundance in the armories of the more militant nations that enough could be released to initiate what he called the real final solution. In going through this bizarre storehouse of strangeness, a great many other opinions were also made by this individual, who euthanizers had dubbed the final prophet, but more usually just the prophet. But principally his chief subject was what they called the negative and what he called inadequacy. It was far from uncommon for him to speak over the entire 90 minutes of the video cassette, then having to split the diatribe into 2, 3 or more parts on other cassettes on solely the woes of the world as he saw them. Nothing, it seemed, was adequate enough for his distinguished tastes. He was eloquent, certainly, and was able to come up with a memorable turn of phrase. But it was his constant speaking itself, the sound of his voice repeating continually key words and phrases and opinions, becoming something like a calming mantra in the minds of euthanizers who avidly listened to reproductions of these recordings, that gained him the posthumous following he could now no longer enjoy. From being reviled and ridiculed in his own time by the few who had actually heard of him, he was finding a slightly larger, albeit fringe-dwelling audience who adored him. And so his pessimist utterings became something of a mental salve for people who, themselves, were looking desperately for salving from their own pains in our shared vale of tears, some voice to give word to their confusions, desperations, anxieties, disappointments, bitterness and frustrations. They were not the kind of people who read, or at least broadly. The philosophers and intellectuals of the past did not interest them so much unless they spoke directly to their preferred subjects, but even then these were not a largely literate people. But videocassettes were a part of their own culture, although role-playing games were their preferred expression. They liked their ideas easy to understand and appealing to their biases. They did, often, indulge in a kind of pretentious pseudo-intellectualism, usually by using as many complex words and phrases as they could remember, making references to concepts like oniotology, biased dissertation, and of course inverted dialectics, which many of them hadn't realised came from a role-playing game, but the ones that did made the excuse that it didn't matter where an idea came from, as long as the idea served their ultimate positive. In short, they considered themselves to be a frustrated elite, people who had seen some kind of ultimate truth with a capital T, and that those who did not share this truth were on the side of the negative, which made them negative, which made them, as the opinion grew more and more, enemies. People who either unwittingly partook in the negativity of life or knowingly added to it by having children out of their own avarice and selfishness. Such, at least, was the emerging narrative of the more radical euthanizers. Because also among the teachings of the prophet could be found references to impunity when it came to committing acts most would label murder. Certainly, these were not his chief subject of conversation, but while not actually advocating murder, his language often stopped short of it. He was uncharacteristically restrained in this. His reasoning was not that murder in itself was wrong, only that murder would leave the murderer at risk of being arrested. It was a fluke in his logic that, on the one hand, he seemed absolutely adamant that all life should end by any means necessary, but, on the other, he and anyone else initiating the ending shouldn't suffer for it. But it was one of many such flukes. Commonly, his ravings were often patchy and connected to each other not so much by central intellectual themes, but a constant personal antagonism against the world. He would, for example, fly into delusions of grandeur, proclaiming himself the greatest thinker who ever thought, that his thoughts would wipe away all previous thought into nothingness, and that only he would be remembered in the future. Another fluke, since he was advocating for there not to be any future. And he would denounce, with the crudest language possible, other people, enemies. He seemed to have acquired quite a list over his time, whose counterpoints to his own incoherent logic he would pull apart, word by word, often extrapolating from mere phrases entire retaliatory rants that would wander off the point, devolving into metaphors stretched to near infinity, while often at the same time decrying his opponents with deliberately misconstruing his own words and arguments and claiming himself a victim of others' arrogance and delusion. Arguments, concepts, ideas, words themselves would all go through a kind of verbal mangler that, while delivered with the utmost conviction, often devolved into outright hubris, making sentences so twisted and contradictory it gave the impression, to the impressionable euthanizers, of genius itself. They were more than happy to overlook his obvious arrogance and delusion, sometimes paying reluctant lip service to acknowledging it when pressed by those who they were arguing with, or quietly to each other, as long as he gave them the salve they desperately sought, the feeling of being in possession of the ultimate truth that flattered their egos and pandered to their biases. And on occasion he would reveal himself more fully, in phrases like, "If only all you motherfucking, cocksucking, ass-kissing assholes had one neck." His flights of verbal fury were a wonder to see and hear. So it slowly became apparent to the euthanizers who had adopted his personality cult that in order to be a true adherent, they felt they had to adopt a similar personality, even if it didn't quite match their own. They began to feel inadequate, as if falling short of their prophet's loftier ambitions, and resolved to improve themselves towards a state they believed he would have approved of, as if it was possible for the man, when he was alive, to approve of anything but himself. Some of them even developed a masochistic taste for such a feeling, from the words of an individual they would never personally know themselves, but had developed in their imaginations an impression of, a stern, absolute, all-correcting authority figure that they had some innate, unspoken, often unacknowledged need for. So the arguments between the euthanizers went on. The prophet had favoured a swift extermination of all life, seeing all of it as inadequate, which fitted the agenda of the total extinction faction very well. As it happened, nearly all euthanizers had some sympathy for the plight of animals both in captivity and in the wild, and veganism was the usual practice. But the issue of imposition was a sharp point of contention, and former friends fell out with each other and denounced each other noisily and messily. A rot had set in, and it seemed to the more radical euthanizers that another surgery was necessary. This was the faction Cutter, Moped and Graham belonged to, a newer faction emerging from the arguments of the bulk of the euthanizers, a faction that had decided that it was not enough to wait for the rest of humanity to join them in the real final solution, but to provoke them towards it. Their reasoning was as follows. The main euthanizer plan had always been to preach, in the hopes that others would follow their reason and take the proclaimed final actions. But after being radicalised by the prophet, this new faction decided that if it was positive for humanity to end itself, and indeed the rest of life on Earth in one fell swoop, it was by the same dint of logic acceptable to end what lives they could in the meantime. This followed the pseudo-logic of inverted dialectics. An ostensive negative wasn't actually negative if it led to what they regarded as a positive, and the prophet had said in his sermons, many times, that to do what he called a small evil today would, by cause and effect, prevent what he called the bigger evil tomorrow. It fitted the inverted dialectical method, albeit unintentionally. It seemed the prophet had died before the game from which the idea came from had been released, and in any case, he didn't seem like the type interested in games outside of his own. Then they reasoned that since terrorist groups had, in the past, radicalised people in their societies through their actions, the same should hold good for the euthanizers in their societies. If they became suicide bombers, they would demonstrate both that it was positive to kill people for the sake of the future, and also do away with the slur that had been slung on them since they started, that if they were consistent with their beliefs they would kill themselves. By becoming suicide bombers, they were being consistent with all their convictions. And they reasoned that even though the majority of society would be horrified, it would certainly radicalise other euthanizers and inspire potential others. Despite initial personal misgivings, they were utterly committed to this. They had talked this among themselves on phone links and over the mail. They had kept their plan within a strictly small group, but had no fear that those within this group who were not party to this particular action they were about to commit would betray them. And so, even though Kata had been, all her life, a rather measly and ineffective individual, much like her present comrades, she had overcome her own self-doubts, anxieties and niggling remnants of conscience to set herself upon this task, which was the apex of what could be called activity, or could be called positive among euthanizers. It was, she and her comrades were utterly convinced, the only way. The plans, designs and necessary components for the 3 suicide belts had been procured by Graham. He explained to Carter and Moped how to put them on, keep them concealed and how to initiate them once they had reached their destination. It had been carefully chosen for maximum impact, the greater potential deaths, and this location in particular as an added protest against bringing more lives into the world and punishment for those who would commit such a crime. So, with their belts underneath their clothes, they walked the few blocks from Moped's and Graham's headquarters to the maternity hospital.